There is a cliff on the eastern shore of Lake Superior with more than 100 paintings on it. They are done in red ochre on white granite, a few feet above the waterline, on a rock face that drops straight into deep cold water. To stand in front of them, you have to walk out onto a sloping ledge of bare stone. When the lake is up, you cannot stand there at all. People have been swept off it. Among the images, there is one that people come specifically to see. It is a four-legged animal seen from the side with horns on its head and a long spined tail curving over its back. It is in the water. The Ojibwe call it Mishipeshu. In English, it is usually rendered as the great lynx or the underwater panther. And in the tradition, what Mishipeshu does is hold the copper. If you watched our investigation into the ancient copper mines of Lake Superior, you already know what that copper is. Thousands of mining pits on Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula already worked when European miners arrived in the 1840s. A multi-ton block of copper raised onto timbers and then abandoned where it sat. That video asked who dug those pits. This one asks something the archaeology cannot answer at all. What did the people who mined that copper believe about where it came from and about what taking it cost? Because the answer to that was painted onto a cliff, and it was written down in 1851 by a man who never saw it. Start with the copper itself, because Lake Superior copper is genuinely unusual, and it explains a great deal. In most of the world, copper has to be smelted out of ore. You find rock containing copper compounds, you heat it, you drive off everything that is not metal. It is a chemical process and it has to be invented. Around Lake Superior, that step is not required. The copper there occurs as native copper, which means it is already metal, sitting in the rock in a nearly pure state. Pieces range from fragments up to masses weighing many tons. Glaciers tore some of it loose and scattered it across the region, which is why chunks of pure metal turn up in gravel and riverbeds far from any vein. So on that lakeshore, and almost nowhere else at that scale, metal is something you can find lying in the ground. People began working it a very long time ago. The tradition of tool making that archaeologists call the Old Copper Complex goes back thousands of years, and it produced knives, awls, spear points, fish hooks and ornaments, cold hammered and annealed rather than cast. Objects made from that copper have been found across an enormous area of the continent, carried far from where the metal came out. That last point is worth slowing down on, because it is how we know the scale. Copper carries a chemical signature. The trace elements in it vary by source, and that signature travels with the metal. So when a copper object turns up in a burial mound 1,000 miles from Lake Superior, it can be traced back. And it has been repeatedly. Lake Superior copper moved down river systems and across the interior of the continent in quantity, over a period measured in millennia. Which means the mining pits on Isle Royale and the Keweenaw were not a local curiosity. They were the source end of a distribution network covering a large fraction of North America, operating without wheels, without draft animals, and without writing as we normally define it. Now think about how that must have looked from inside the culture that had it. Every other useful material behaves in an ordinary way. Stone flakes, wood burns, bone breaks. This one substance is different. It is bright. It bends instead of shattering. You can hammer it thin and it takes an edge. It comes out of a specific lake in one place and nowhere else in that quantity. A mineral like that does not get treated as an ordinary resource. It gets an owner. And in the traditions of the Anishinaabe peoples around that lake, the owner is Mishipeshu. He is described as a great cat. Some accounts give him copper scales or copper horns. He has a long tail, spined or serrated, and he lives in the deep water. He is not a benign figure. He is associated with sudden storms, with dangerous currents, with drowning. When he moves his tail, the water rises, and he holds the copper. In some accounts, the copper of Lake Superior is his, and to take it is to take from him. One recorded telling has a chief named Maingun standing on the cliffs above the lake as a war party of Iroquois canoes crossed toward Ojibwe country. He called on Mishipeshu. The lake rose and the canoes were destroyed. That is not a story about a monster. It is a story about who controls the water, and by extension who controls access to what is under it. And Mishipeshu does not stand alone. He sits inside a structure. In Anishinaabe cosmology, there's an upper world and a lower world, and they are in opposition. The upper world belongs to the thunderers, the Anamiki, the thunderbirds. They are of the sky and the storm. The lower world is water and earth, and what is underneath, and Mishipeshu belongs to it. The two are antagonists. Thunder strikes at the water. The powers below answer. That is worth pausing on, because it means the being who holds the copper is on the underneath side of a divided world. The metal comes out of the ground, from the lower world, from the domain of the thing that drowns people. It is not a neutral commodity that happens to have a guardian attached as decoration. Its origin and its owner are the same fact, and it means that anyone digging that copper out was, in the terms of their own cosmology, reaching into a place that belonged to something else, not metaphorically. Structurally, Various traditions describe protective procedure around that and describe consequences for people who take too much or take without the proper conduct, which is a coherent position and worth stating plainly before we go further. This is not superstition attached to an economic activity. It is an account of what that activity is. If this kind of investigation is worth your time, subscribing helps, which brings us to the document. The first written record of these paintings appears in 1851 in the published work of Henry Rowe Schoolcraft. Schoolcraft was an American Indian agent based at Sault Ste. Marie on the water between Lake Superior and Lake Huron. He spent decades collecting Ojibwe material and publishing it, and his work is the single largest early body of recorded Ojibwe tradition in existence. He learned about the painted rock from an Ojibwe leader named Shingwauk, whose name is usually translated as Little Pine. And here's the part that matters. Schoolcraft never went there. He never saw the cliff. What he had was Shingwauk, sitting with him drawing the images from memory on a piece of birch bark and explaining what they meant. That is the source. A drawing from memory, an oral explanation, and a man with a notebook who could not check any of it. Now there is something in Schoolcraft's own writing that deserves more attention than it usually gets, because he recorded a limit on his own understanding. He noted that Ojibwe picture writing came in two kinds. There were signs whose meaning was open, readable by anyone in the culture who saw them, and there were signs that could only be interpreted by someone with specific knowledge held by particular people, not given out generally. He wrote that distinction down, and he was on the wrong side of it. And that distinction is not a small technical note. It points at something people are often surprised to learn exists. The Anishinaabe had a system of inscribed record. Images were incised into birch bark on scrolls, and those scrolls were used to hold and transmit specific content. The best documented use is within the Mijuawin, the medicine society, where scrolls carried the order of ceremony, the sequence of a teaching, migration accounts, the structure of things that had to be reproduced correctly across generations. These are not decorative, they are mnemonic. A person who had been taught what the marks referred to could read a scroll and recover what it held. A person who had not been taught could look at exactly the same object and see shapes. That is precisely the two categories Schoolcraft described: open signs and restricted signs. And it means the images on that cliff are not folk art in the sense a European visitor would have assumed. They belong to a culture that had a working technology for storing information in images and a social structure controlling who could read it. Some of what is on that rock was almost certainly meant to be read by anybody. Some of it was meant to be read by specific people who had been prepared to read it. Schoolcraft was recording a system that he understood well enough to know it had a locked section, and not well enough to open it, which means the published account of these paintings, from the beginning, was known by the man publishing it to be partial. And every later interpretation that traces back through him inherits that limit, whether or not it acknowledges it. That admission sat in print for 107 years, while nobody went and found the rock. Selwyn Dewdney found it in 1958. Dewdney was a Canadian who spent years locating and documenting rock art across the Canadian Shield, and he worked from Schoolcraft's published sketches. The Lake Superior shoreline is hundreds of miles of granite and forest with no roads along most of it. He located the site at Agawa Bay, in what is now Lake Superior Provincial Park in Ontario, roughly 100 miles north of the Sioux. The Ojibwe name for the place is Mazinalbikini, the adorned rock. What Dewdney found was not a single painting. It is a cliff with more than 100 images spread across about a dozen panels, canoes, human figures, serpents with legs, circles, a man on horseback, abstract marks, and multiple images of Mishipeshu. The paintings are in red ochre, which is iron oxide mixed with a binder. Nobody can date them directly. Ochre contains no organic carbon to radiocarbon, and the rock underneath is vastly older than anything painted on it. Estimates run from a few centuries to considerably more, and they are estimates. The setting is part of the object, and it is easy to miss if you only ever see photographs. The cliff is white crystalline granite, and the red sits against it with a contrast that carries a long way across the water. The paintings are low, close to the surface of the lake. They are not up on a height where they can be seen from a distance in every direction. They are at the waterline, on a face that a canoe would pass. Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake in the world by surface area. It is cold enough year-round to kill quickly, and its weather turns without much warning. The shoreline there is rock and forest with very few landing places. So the audience for these images is a specific one. Somebody on the water, close in, going along that shore. Which is to say, somebody moving through the territory of the being painted on the rock. At the moment they were most exposed to him. That placement is not accidental, and it changes how the central image reads. Because remember what Mishipeshu is, not a creature that might be sighted, a power of the lower world, of water and of what lies under it, in permanent opposition to the thunderers above, the one who holds the copper, the one whose tail movement is the wave that takes the canoe, an image of him at the waterline, on the one stretch of shore where the copper comes out of the ground, addressed to people in boats. And then there's the one panel with a documented history, which is the most interesting object on that cliff. One of the Mishipeshu images is attributed to Xinguo Konsei, and that is the same man as Xinguo, the leader who sat with Schoolcraft and drew the images from memory. In the 19th century, he led a party against copper miners who were moving onto the Lake Superior shore at a place called Mamenze and taking the copper. According to the account, he fasted at the rock for several days first. Then he painted Mishipeshu. Understand what that act is. He chose that image specifically because Mishipeshu is the holder of the copper. He was making a statement about ownership in the only permanent public medium available to him at a site that already carried that meaning. Go back to our copper video for a moment. That video was about pits in the ground and a boulder on timbers, and it ended without knowing who dug them or why the work stopped. Here on this cliff is the other half of the subject. Not the extraction, the claim over it, and a 19th century political act against an industrial mining operation made in ochre by a man who fasted first. Now the part where we have to clear something out of the way. If you search for Mishipeshu, a large proportion of what comes back treats him as a lake monster, a cryptid, something in the same category as an unidentified animal that might be photographed from a boat. There are thumbnails of a horned creature surfacing in a lake, and titles asking whether it is real. That framing is wrong, and it is not wrong in an interesting way, it is a category error. Mishipeshu is not a proposed animal. Nobody in the tradition is claiming there is an undiscovered species of horned aquatic cat in Lake Superior. He is a manitou, a being of the sort that holds and governs a part of the world. Asking whether he is real in the sense that a wolverine is real is like asking for the coordinates of a saint. And the cryptid framing does specific damage, strips out everything the tradition is actually carrying, which is a set of statements about a lake that kills people, a metal found in one place on Earth, and who has the right to take it. Reduced to a monster hunt, all of that disappears. And what is left is a thumbnail. This is the same move you have seen on this channel before. The stone wall on Fort Mountain got assigned to a Welsh prince. The earthworks of Georgia got assigned to the Maya. The copper of Lake Superior got assigned to Bronze Age Europeans who supposedly shipped it across the Atlantic, a claim that has produced nothing in a century and a half. Each time, the version of the story that a native tradition actually tells gets replaced with a version imported from outside, and the imported version gets the attention. Here, the import is a monster. Same pattern, smaller costume, now the honest caution because this channel does not work without it. Schoolcraft is a difficult source, and specialists have said so for a long time. He never saw the site. He was working through translation. He had his own theories about native peoples that shaped what he recorded and how he presented it. Some of what he published has been shown to be reworked. His account of the Agawa paintings is brief, and its reliability is genuinely questioned. The dating is not settled and may never be. Different panels may be separated by centuries. The horse in one panel has to post-date the arrival of horses, which puts at least that image in a known window, but that tells you nothing about the rest of the cliff. The meanings are contested. Different sources give different accounts of what the same panel shows. Some of the interpretations in circulation trace back through Schoolcraft, which means they are not independent of him. And a real amount of what these images mean is not public and was never meant to be. That is not a gap waiting to be filled by better research. It is a boundary that the people who hold the knowledge have chosen to maintain. There is a story that illustrates that better than any explanation. In 1981, an anthropologist named Thor Conway went to two of Xinguo's descendants, wanting to understand the pictographs. They turned him away. He did not get an interview. What he got, eventually, over a long period, was an apprenticeship. He has described it as being prepared, slowly, before he could be told anything about this material at all. Read that as a statement about the material, rather than about the men. They were not being obstructive. They were applying the rule Schoolcraft himself had written down 130 years earlier. Some of this is restricted, and the restriction is not a formality. You do not hand it to a stranger with a notebook, because the stranger is interested and has traveled a long way. The knowledge came with a condition attached, and the condition was part of the knowledge. Compare that to what happened in 1851. A government agent, a conversation, a piece of birch bark, and a book. The difference between those two encounters is most of what this story is about, and there is a practical consequence that visitors to the site still meet. The custom at that rock is to offer tobacco to the water before viewing the paintings, asking permission of what is there. People who go today are told this by guides and by signage. It is a small thing, and it is easy to treat as local color. It is not local color. It is the same proposition the paintings make, that the place has an owner, that the owner is in the water, and that you do not simply take what you came for. So what is actually still open? Not whether the paintings are there. They are there photographed, protected inside a provincial park, visited by thousands of people a year who walk out on that ledge when the lake is calm. What is open is almost everything else. Who painted most of them? when what the majority of the images mean, whether Schoolcraft's account of any specific panel is accurate or a reconstruction filtered through a translator and a man with a theory. And the largest open question is one that has no research program attached to it because it cannot have one. There is a system of meaning on that cliff. Schoolcraft himself recorded that the system had a section that required specific knowledge to read. That knowledge belonged to particular people. Some of those people died in the century that followed, during which the languages that carried it were actively suppressed in schools across both countries. Some proportion of what is painted on that rock was readable by somebody and is not readable now. Nobody can say how much. There's no method for measuring what has been lost, because measuring it would require the thing that is gone. The copper is still there too. Native metal in the rock along that shore, the same as it was when the first pits were dug thousands of years ago. And on a granite cliff above the water, in red ochre, above a ledge you can only stand on when the lake permits it, there is a painting of the thing that holds it. Some of the people who look at that painting today will not be able to read it. One of them fasted for days before he made it, and he knew exactly what he was saying.